President Obama imposed sanctions on Russia recently in response to allegations that the Russian president hacked the election, as they're putting it. Not all Republicans disagreed with that. In fact, some said President Obama didn't go far enough with those sanctions. That group includes Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, a member of the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services Committees. He joins us now from the Russell Rotunda in the U.S. Capitol. Senator, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tucker. Happy New Year to you and your viewers.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you. So the president imposed these sanctions and expelled those 35 Russian diplomats in part because he believed what a lot of people in Washington believe, which is that Vladimir Putin weighed in order to help President-elect Trump get elected. And yet we're hearing now from people who would know that that's not a certainty. So here is the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence yesterday. He said, and I'm quoting, "There's no proof we have from intelligence sources I've seen that show the Russians were directly trying to help Trump." Then this morning, Jim Woolsey, the former CIA director, said this morning that it's not at all clear that Russia did this, and if it did, that it acted alone. So my question is simple. Do we know enough to act in the way we have with Russia, to impose these sanctions and expel the diplomats?
Tucker, I don't think we know enough yet about exactly what happened with the hacking of the DNC and then the dissemination of those emails. Now, I have called for a long time for us to take a firmer line with Russia. So while I think the president took some good initial steps last week, it's not specifically about the hacking of the DNC. It's about Russia's behavior for the last 8 years. Why did they think they could get away with doing something like hacking into the DNC? It's because President Obama has consistently looked the other way on their aggression. Remember, just months after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, President Obama came to office and they pressed the reset button with Vladimir Putin. In the middle of his campaign in 2012, he promised the Russian president to wait till after the election he'd have more flexibility. And then when Mitt Romney called Russia one of our #1 geopolitical adversaries, he laughed and mocked him in a debate. All these things are reasons why Vladimir Putin thinks he can get away with acting contrary to the U.S. interest. He ought not, or Russia ought not to have hacked into the DNC. They ought to pay a price for that, a stiffer price than they have. However, if you were to make a list of Russia's crimes and transgressions against the United States and our interest over the last 8 years, that would be way down the list.
So, I mean, I think everything you said is totally defensible. I personally agree with all of it. And yet there is a bigger picture. So Russia is on our side fundamentally in the struggle that most of us recognize is the main one, which is against Islamic extremism. We share common interests. We see this with a lot of other countries. A lot of our allies spy on us. In fact, I think they all do. Israel, Great Britain, Germany. I mean, they've all broken into our computers or spied on us, and we're still allied with them because we have common interests, and we should be. So why wouldn't Russia fall into that category?
Well, all those other countries don't do things like beat our diplomats in Moscow when they're walking in the front door of our embassy. They don't harass our diplomats throughout Russia and throughout the Middle East. They don't invade sovereign countries in Europe like Russia did in Ukraine and like they did in Georgia. They don't supply missiles to rebels that use those missiles to shoot civilian aircraft out of the skies. They don't run illegal spy rings in our countries for decades or then expose. These are just all examples of things that Russia has done over the last 8 years in no small measure because Barack Obama has not just appeased Russia and been weak on Russia, he's actively undermined efforts by people in Congress like me to take a firmer line. I agree. I mean, I agree with all that, and there's no question that Russia has a many decades-long history of causing mischief around the world. And here, I would say that a lot of our allies do run illegal spy rings in our country, as you know, and we look the other way. But it doesn't answer the bigger question, though. Aren't we basically on the same side as the Russians on the question of Islamic terror? It doesn't mean ignoring or excusing their awful behavior, but doesn't that outweigh that behavior? Well, Tucker, I wish it were so, but if you look at what Russia has done in Syria, they've taken the fight hardly at all to the Islamic State. They fought almost entirely the Syrian opposition that was fighting against Bashar al-Assad. They haven't been bombing Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State. They've been bombing Aleppo, which is the main opposition holdout until it fell last month. It would be a good thing if Russia would work with the rest of the civilized world to counteract the threat of Islamic extremism, because they have their own Islamic extremists in the Caucasus region. But they simply are not doing that in Syria. They're not doing much of it around the world either.
So one of the explanations for Russia's behavior is the drop, as you know, in oil prices, which has made the country less stable, poorer, more desperate, and countries in that condition tend to act out. We see it with the North Koreans. Won't sanctions potentially exacerbate that? In other words, if Russia becomes even poorer and more cornered, won't its behavior become less predictable and more destructive?
Well, I think the reason that Vladimir Putin has become more aggressive over the last 8 years is that he doesn't have a sense of boundaries from President Obama. This goes back 5 years to his election as president for a third term after he had stepped aside for 4 years and become prime minister. Throughout the 2000s, he enjoyed an oil boom, and that was good for the Russian economy. But over the last 5 years, in his third term, he's had to whip up a nationalist frenzy in Russia. That goes far back before the sanctions related to Ukraine. It goes back before the sanctions that President Obama imposed last week. What we need with Vladimir Putin is a new sense of boundaries. We need to impose new boundaries, and we need to impose cost when he crosses those boundaries. This is something that Ronald Reagan did. Ronald Reagan made the moral case against totalitarian communism in the Soviet Union, but he also did some fundamental things to change the strategic equation, like rebuilding our military, like deploying intermediate range missiles to Europe.
Right.
Donald Trump promises to do those exact same things. In fact, he promised them in the campaign to rebuild our military and to upgrade our nuclear arsenal and to build missile defenses. Hillary Clinton is the one that was promising policies in the campaign that actually would have emboldened Russia and given them even more strategic advantage.
But Trump's out there basically saying nice things about Vladimir Putin on Twitter as an avowed opponent of Putin, someone who thinks that sanctions should be even tougher. Does that bother you?
Well, I think Donald Trump views Russia and China and most other countries fundamentally from an American standpoint that we need to have a firmer line. We need to represent American interests. That's why he often uses the phrase "America first." Ultimately, you often have to sit down and negotiate with your worst adversaries, and those adversaries are often pretty bad actors. Ronald Reagan, after the build-up and after drawing a firm line in his first administration, sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev, negotiated some pretty far-reaching treaties, and ultimately that helped lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
No, that's
I think
true.
it's important to take a firm line. It's important to take a firm line with all of our adversaries. That doesn't mean in the end, though, that you can't negotiate from a position of strength when you have genuine overlapping interest or you have something you can genuinely bargain for. For 8 years, though, Barack Obama has simply looked the other way. He's tried to hold back people in the Congress who want to impose boundaries on Russia, and he's given away the shop to Russia.
Senator Cotton, thanks a lot for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.